So let's look at sexual reproduction in plants. We could give a whole course about this, but I'll spare you with a brief lecture. I once saw a very memorable quote at the beginning of a book called The Plants of the Llano Estocado, a book about the flora of New Mexico. And it said, "A flower is a plant's way of saying hi." And indeed it is, to attract the intermediaries, the pollinators, who are going to carry its pollen to another of its same species for fertilization. Sometimes these are living pollinators, sometimes flowers rely on wind or water to carry their pollen. Sexual reproduction involves ovules, which contain egg cells, and pollen, which contains sperm cells of plants, and a seed is formed when a sperm fertilizes an egg. So these haploid gametes with one set of chromosomes form a diploid zygote, two sets of chromosomes, with one set of chromosomes from the female parent that provides the ovule, one set from the male, from the pollen parent, and that zygote becomes the embryo plant. When the seed germinates, that embryonic plant becomes a seedling and eventually grows into an adult plant. So let's see what I mean by all these things looking at this diagram. The body of almost all plants, except for mosses and other bryophytes, is the sporophyte of the plant, the spore-bearing part, diploid. The gametophytes in angiosperms are the most reduced of any plants and are inside the ovule and inside the pollen grains of plants. So the flower is a specialized short shoot of a plant. Here it is in close-up, and all of these organs of the flower, the sepals, the petals, the stamens, carpels that make up the pistil, the female part of the plant, they're all modified leaves. So pollination happens usually on a more macroscopic scale, but fertilization you may need a microscope to see. Here is a section of the anther with the microsporangia in each of the anther sacs, which divide to make the microspores, and a microspore is a pollen grain. And so the pollen grains, PGs, all right here, pollen grains. Here's one of them that has germinated, and there are two sperm coming down. One of the sperm will fertilize the egg. One will combine with the polar nuclei to make the triploid endosperm. The development of the female gametophyte inside an ovule, inside the ovary, is shown here. A much larger cell undergoes meiosis, and 4 megaspores, 3 degenerate, and only one divides to become this megagametophyte inside the double integumented ovule. So this is what participates. Oh, I forgot to say, this is the pollen grain. Oops. That's the pollen grain that's germinating here. So here we have female and male coming together for fertilization. And then this fertilized ovule becomes the seed. Here's a photo taken under a compound microscope of 2 pollen grains germinating on the papillate surface of the stigma. These things are stigmatic papillae that may be exuding some liquid to help the pollen germinate. And here are the pollen tubes from these 2 pollen grains. So flowering plants fit into pollination syndromes, which are suites of characters commonly held by plants visited by certain types of flower visitor. These are categories that let us predict who the pollinators might be. But to really know the pollinators, you have to observe it and study it during all the hours that the flowers are open. So the characteristics that go into the syndrome are the color of the flower, the shape, and the depth. These are morphological features. Is the flower radially symmetrical or bilaterally symmetrical? How is it oriented? Is it sticking up in the air to provide a landing platform? Is it hanging down, or is it held sideways so that visitors have to hover to take their rewards? What time does it open? Morning, afternoon, evening? And what are the rewards? Something to eat or drink, something to collect to feed the brood, and sometimes odor is also involved in attracting visitors. A problem, however, with syndromes is that they imply that there's more specialization than maybe really exists. And most flowers, when we actually study them, have a variety of visitors. And most of the visitors have pollen on their bodies, so can move pollen and fertilize flowers, although some are often better than others for any given plant species. Here are two flowering plants from our native flora. To the left is Bursonema lucida in the Malpighiaceae, the locust berry, this is called. And it's an unusual plant from tropical origins that has oil as a flower reward. And that oil is collected only by certain types of bees, like this little bee here in the genus Centris. To the right is a pineland cluster vine, Jacomantia curtisii, with wide open, small white flowers. These are about as big as a quarter, a coin, a 25-cent piece. And these are being wide open with nectar in the middle. They're open to a wide variety of visitors, little flies, big flies, bees, and butterflies. So I guess it's clear why plants would go to all this trouble, that it is an advantage to reproduce sexually because that maintains genetic diversity. Even if plants self-pollinate, they get a new combination of genes because of independent assortment and recombination. And that is the raw material of evolution, this variation, important to meet all challenges of a changing environment. But there are drawbacks. Not only is it expensive to attract pollinators, making these structures with rewards in them, but it may be hard to find a good mate. They may not be around. Or pollinators, the go-betweens, may be scarce. In addition, once seeds are produced, those little tiny things produce seedlings, and it's difficult for a seedling to get established. Not only that, but certain herbivores love to eat flowers, fruits, and seeds. But still, plants do it. In the evolution of many breeding systems, frequency-dependent selection is at play, where the fitness of a genotype depends whether it's common or rare in the population. And some plants have heterostylous breeding systems where there are two or more flower morphs, so that every individual plant has flowers all of the same morph, so that a visitor visiting many flowers on the same plant won't pollinate. It won't put the pollen on the stigma till it goes to a plant of the other morph, and this promotes outcrossing. So there may be distyly, two forms, or tristyly, and our book chooses to show this diagram of a more complicated tristilous system, where there are three morphs named for the style length, the stigmas being here. This drawing doesn't really draw them beautiful enough, I think, to tell that they're different from stamens. But anyway, in the long-styled morph, there are stamens at two different levels, mid and short, In the mid-styled morph, here's the style at the mid-length, there are anthers long and short, and in the short-styled morph, there are anthers long and mid. And maybe you can imagine that a pollinator coming into the flower, sticking its head into the flower this way, would get pollen on certain parts of the body, and repeatedly visiting flowers on the same plant wouldn't manage to deposit the pollen on the stigma because the pollen's in a different part of the body. But when it visits any other morph, or a morph with the stigma at the right height to match where the pollen is, it's picked up, it will cross-pollinate. Some more about frequency-dependent selection. A tristilus plant, Lythrum salicaria, the purple loosestrife, was introduced into North America. 24 different populations that were invading Canada were sampled, and the style lengths weren't represented equally. But 5 years later, there were closer to equal frequencies of the three style morphs, and expected frequencies of the morphs in a tristilus population is 1 to 1 to 1, and for distyly, 1 to 1. One of the coolest plants in the Everglades pine rocklands is the rough-leafed velvet seed, Guettarda scabra, and it has distyly, but of an unusual form, more or less continuous variation in style anther separation among individuals of this species. If we classify them as those with the styles below the mouth of the corolla, inserted, and those with styles sticking above the mouth of the corolla, above the anthers, because the anthers are at the mouth of the corolla tube, those are with exserted styles, there is a ratio of 1 to 1, and evidence that outcrossing is promoted by differential pollen placement. Here's a photo of this plant. It's dark because the flowers are open mostly at night, and in the upper right-hand corner, maybe you can see this flying cigar. This is actually a hawk moth, which has its proboscis into the flower where it's picking up pollen. Here are longitudinal sections of flowers from two different plants. This one is a short-styled morph. Oops, I think I've got this backwards. The short-styled morph here with an inserted style, here's the style, and a long-styled morph here with the stigma sticking up above the anthers, which are at the mouth of the corolla tube, both of these places. Here's a picture of the rough-leaf velvet seed in fruit. You can see the fruits are green, and then when they're ripe, they become these big, soft, velvety berries. So this is why it's called the velvet seed. And they germinate after you roast the seeds for a while to produce seedlings, shown in the lower right. But what's interesting about Guettarda scabra is the morphs are not only cross-compatible, but self-pollinations also produce seed. In fact, certain individuals set fruit with no pollination at all. So we're trying to figure out what's going on here. It might be that this is the northernmost part of the range, and the breeding system is breaking down, or maybe life is too hard, although my observations so far have shown no shortage of hawk moth and butterfly pollinators.